So, you want to know what in the world is a Presbyterian? Well, grab a cup of coffee or perhaps your favorite beverage and stick around and find out. Hi, I'm John Judson, and I welcome you to this series on what in the world is a Presbyterian. Again, Presbyterians are people who believe certain things and who govern themselves in certain ways. And we're going to talk more about how we govern ourselves. We're going to do so by talking about the second part of our Constitution, which is the Book of Order. Yes, we Presbyterians have a Constitution. It's composed of two parts. The first part is our Book of Confessions, and we're going to have an entirely different video talking about our Book of Confessions. The second part is the Book of Order. Now, our Book of Order is divided into four parts. The first is the foundations of Presbyterian polity. The second is the form of government. The third is the directory for worship. And the fourth is the rules of discipline. And we're going to talk about each one of these. Now, the first part is the foundation of Presbyterian polity. Polity is just another word for talking about how we govern ourselves. It's one of those fancy Presbyterian kind of words. Now, the foundations of Presbyterian polity really do give us the foundations that if you were to read nothing other than this part of the Book of Order, you would understand why Presbyterians govern themselves the way that they do. And so, let's begin. First, it gives us our theological foundations. It talks about God. Who is God? What is God up to in the world? What does God desire of us? It talks about Jesus Christ, the centrality and importance of Jesus Christ in our life. It talks about what Christ has done and what Christ is doing. It tells us about the Holy Spirit. What's the Spirit up to? What is the Spirit doing today? What has the Spirit done in the past? It reminds us that we are part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Holy means we're set aside for a particular purpose. Catholic means we're part of the universal church. And apostolic means we follow after the teachings of the apostles. So we're part of the one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. Finally, it helps us understand what it means to be reformed. Reformed means essentially three things in this case. It means that the word is rightly preached, that we preach appropriately out of the Scriptures. Two, that the sacraments are rightly administered, that we do them decently and in order. And thirdly, that we exercise church discipline. But I'll talk more about that when we get to the rules of discipline. Second, in this foundational part of the Book of Order, it talks about our confessions. Why do we have confessions? How should we be using confessions? What are our confessions? Third and finally, it gives us a sort of ecclesiastical government foundation. Why do we govern the way we govern? And there are two parts to this, the principles of church order and the historic principles of church government. Now, we're going to have short videos. So lessons 4 and 5 will cover both of those. So you might want to check those out to find out more about why we govern ourselves the way that we do. The second section of the Book of Order is the form of government. This is actually sort of the foundation of why we govern ourselves the way we do. This doesn't tell us everything we ought to do as a congregation, but it sets out step by step how we are to organize ourselves. The first chapter is about congregations. What are congregations? How are congregations formed? What ought congregations to be doing? Chapter 2 has to do with what's called ordered ministry. Simply put, ordered ministry are the elders, deacons, and ministers of word and sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA. It tells us who ought to be an elder or a deacon or a minister of word and sacrament, How do you go about recruiting these people? How are they to be trained? How are they to be ordained and installed? And so in this section, chapter 2, you're going to find out all about ordered ministry. Chapter 3 has to do with councils. Council is a fancy word to talk about governing bodies in the Presbyterian Church USA. The council of the congregation is called the session. It is all currently installed and active elders. Now, the thing about elders is once an elder, always an elder. But this is the installed elders, along with all installed pastors. They're the session. The council of a bunch of congregations in a geographic area is called the presbytery. And they meet on a regular basis to assist churches in being the kind of churches they ought to do and doing mission and work together. But this is the council of a geographic grouping of churches. And these meetings are composed of equal numbers of ruling elders and of ministers in word and sacrament. Now, there's a geographic grouping of presbyteries, and this is called the synod. And it meets on a regular basis. And once again, the synod, when it meets, is composed of an equal number of ministers of word and sacrament and ruling elders. Finally, there's the council of the whole church. The council of the whole church is called the General Assembly. Ours in the PCUSA meets every other year. It makes pronouncements, it makes changes to the Book of Order, and again, it is composed of equal numbers of ruling elders and ministers of word and sacraments who are elected not by the synods, but by the presbyteries. And so those are the councils, or the ruling bodies of the church. Chapter 4 has to do with civil authority. Now, every congregation in the PCUSA is required to be a corporation. We are to be incorporated. And so that's contained within this. Also, it talks about privacy. What sort of privacy should a pastor have when they counsel with congregation members or others? It talks about the things we are mandated to report to the state. Child abuse, other kinds of abuse, elder abuse. It also talks about who owns property. In the PCUSA, all property is held in trust for the denomination. The individual church, even though it might have title to its property, the property is held in trust. And only the presbytery, which we'll talk about in another video, only the presbytery can allow a church to leave with its property. Chapter 5 talks about ecumenicity and union. In other words, how is our denomination related to other denominations? How are we in full communion and union with other denominations? Because we are in full communion with a number of other denominations. And this explains how we go about this and what it means. Chapter 6 is about interpreting and amending the Constitution. In other words, it lays out how do you amend the Book of Confessions? Because several years ago we added a new confession to our Book of Confessions, or how do we change the Book of Order? All of that is contained within chapter 6. The next part of the Book of Order is the Directory for Worship. And this is one of the best written pieces about worship I've ever come across. And so I really encourage you to take the time to read it. And by the way, the Book of Order is available for free from the PCUSA website. You can download a copy and read it for yourself. But the Directory for Worship talks about why we worship. What's this? Why do we do this strange thing on Sunday mornings where we come together and we sing songs and we listen to the word preached? Why do we do that? It explains that. It explains why we worship as we do. Because any of you who have ever worshiped in other congregations, be they Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Independent, Pentecostal, you understand that we worship differently. So why do we do that? The Book of Order explains that. It explains who ought to be in worship. Basically, all of us, but it talks about that. It tells us what ought to be a part of worship. Why do we have a call to worship? Why do we have hymns? Why do we have prayers? Why do we have, or should we have, a prayer of confession? Should we read part of one of our confessions in worship? Should we administer the sacrament? Should we have communion every Sunday or only on a regular basis? All of these things are discussed in the directory for worship. Now, it also tells us, interestingly enough, what worship ought to look like out in the world. It talks about the fact that in some ways, everything we do ought to be worship. Every word we speak, every act of compassion, how we go about our daily life as a student or as an employee or an employer, all of these things ought to be informed by worship, the worship of God in Jesus Christ through the Spirit. And so, as I said, this is a marvelous part of the Book of Order, and I encourage you to download a copy and read it. Finally, is the fourth part is the rules of discipline. And for a lot of people, they're surprised that we would have rules of discipline. But the rules of discipline, which, by the way, it's the longest section in the Book of Order, but the rules of discipline are there to protect the individual and to protect the church. They're there to protect the individual. Suppose that someone makes an accusation against a fellow church member. The question is, how ought we to go about investigating this? How ought we to go about finding out if this is true or false? This is all laid out, how we do this. This is laid out in a way that protects the individual so that there's an orderly way of investigating, making accusations. The person gets to defend themselves. And I've watched where this was not done well, and it harmed the individual. In a church I was part of in Texas, prior to my arrival, the church, some members of the church believed that another member was having an affair. And so they immediately accused this person publicly, and the session, the council of the church, voted to remove this person from membership. Well, it turned out this person was not having an affair at all. This was a false accusation, and the problem was the church did not follow the rules of discipline and thus harmed this individual. Now, the other side of this is that the rules of discipline are there to protect the church. In another church in Texas, there was a gentleman who would regularly, an elder, who would regularly corner women in various rooms and say inappropriate things and touch them in inappropriate ways. And the question was, how do you deal with this? Well, the session followed the rules of discipline. They essentially had a trial. They laid out what the witnesses had to say, and they removed this person from the life and work of the church in order to protect the women of the church. And this is what the rules of discipline are intended to do, to protect the individual and to protect the church. Well, now you know a bit more about our Book of Order, about how you can find out why we govern ourselves the way that we do. On this day, I hope after you've watched this, you'll just be grateful for something. Find something for which you are grateful. And thanks for watching.